We're rocking and rolling. So Patrick McKeown is with us today. Pat, I got to tell you, this is, I said it to you before I pressed play, but I have to mention for the boys because they'll get a kick out of this for the whole MindStrong crew, but you're the Yoda of breathing to the boys here. So I'm trying to compose my early morning adrenaline, and I didn't drink a full coffee yet, so I don't get too excited as we have you on the show. But thank you for giving the time away to us, man. And I'll give an introduction in a second there. But before we dive into it, where are you right now in terms of the world?
So I'm just in the west coast of Ireland. It's a place called Galway, a small town. It's about 40,000 people.
Wow, is that where you're from originally?
No, I'm from the east coast. I moved here about 20 years ago. It was a romance, as you
Okay.
do.
Okay, nice. Okay, so how we came about, and Patrick, you can take us deeper because I know you're doing a lot of stuff, but I mean, like our breathing book that is like the Bible to us in the breathing world is the Oxygen Advantage, which you're obviously the author of that, and then I know you guys have the Oxygen Advantage as a company. You do some breathing with XPT out in Malibu with Laird and Gabby's crew, Buteyko, and all sorts of things. I loved your podcast on London Real. That was amazing, and you've done a lot of stuff. We've done our due diligence of following you and learning from you and listening to you. So it is an honor to have you on the podcast. But can you, for the people who are going to hear this, can you kind of give a simplified breakdown of what you're doing and exactly kind of how your life looks as a whole, and then we can kind of dive into it from there?
Sure. So in terms of breathing, it's good to look at breathing in terms of two pillars. One pillar is your everyday breathing. How do you breathe every day? Because it's your everyday breathing that impacts how you breathe during sports and how you breathe during sleep, and also contributes to how do you deal with stress.
Mm-hmm.
And everyday breathing is divided into three aspects, or I tend to divide it into three aspects. One is the biochemistry of the breath, which is centered on the gas carbon dioxide. One is the biomechanics of the breath, which is centered on breathing low using your diaphragm. And the other is the respiratory rate or cadence. And we use cadence breathing to improve heart rate variability and respiratory sinus arrhythmia. It's effective for people who are, suffering from stress, anxiety, or people with PTSD, etc. And then the second pillar is using breath hold techniques to lower blood oxygen saturation to severe hypoxia and to increase carbon dioxide quite significantly. So it's the changes to both of these blood gases that disturb the blood acid-base balance, and this increases the buffering capacity, which delays lactic acid and fatigue. Now, there's other stuff going on there, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's to stay on that one. I mean, we'll dive deep into all those pillars, I know, but to stay on the hypoxia work, and that's something that really changed the game for me as an athlete and now as a coach. It's something that everyone that I train, we take them through breath hold practices. We've sort of, like I said, fallen through a lot of the guidance that you have. It's kind of measuring out their Bolt score early and seeing where they're at and how well they can kind of hold the breath hold in the beginning, and then we kind of progress them from there, like walks, jog, running. Maybe we have some sled pushes or anything like that. But can you sort of dive deep into what oxygen because I wasn't familiar with what even oxygen saturation was, and then until I started dropping it and feeling mentally the fear of that, and then getting used to that first and foremost, and then understanding like the benefits of it. I'm a former baseball player, so lactic acid was a huge buzzword for us, and I don't think I understood it as much until I really dove into the Oxygen Advantage. But can you kind of go into the depths of what oxygen
Sure.
saturation is telling us?
Sure. So you can measure your blood oxygen saturation very easily. You could use a handheld device, and you basically it's a finger probe. You put it on your pointing finger, and it's measuring how fully loaded are your red blood cells with oxygen. So most oxygen in the blood is carried by red blood cells, by hemoglobin molecules. And your blood oxygen saturation is the fraction of your red blood cells that are carrying oxygen. And normally it's between 95 to 99%. Now, athletes will typically do high intensity interval training or high intensity training to stimulate anaerobic glycolysis. And if you wear a pulse oximeter when you see that saturation drops down to about 93%. And with nose breathing, it drops down to about 91%. And that's hardly, you're still in relatively normal blood oxygen saturation, albeit low. But it's only when your blood oxygen saturation drops down to below 91% that you can make a claim that you're going into hypoxia. So with the breath holding, we always exhale and hold the breath because it's much more likely to put the body into a hypoxic state, inadequate oxygen. And our objective is to bring the blood oxygen saturation down into the early 80s. Now, sometimes our guys go into the 70s.
Yeah.
We don't want people going below 60% because there's a risk of fainting and passing out. And I suppose it's a little bit different what we do if you were to compare it to the Wim Hof technique. We don't do hyperventilation pre-breath holding. We do breath holding on an exhalation following normal breathing to drop the blood oxygen saturation to severe, but also to increase carbon dioxide to quite high levels. And that's having a double effect because from the drop to blood oxygen saturation, the hydrogen ion coming from the cells doesn't get oxidized to form water. And as a result, it associates with pyruvic acid to form lactic acid. And then lactic acid dissociates into hydrogen ion and lactate. But at the same time, carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood during the breath hold. And carbon dioxide, it forms carbonic acid and then dissociates into bicarbonate and hydrogen ion. So you have an increased hydrogen ion coming from the hypoxic state, and you've got an increased hydrogen ion coming from the high carbon dioxide. So this is how it's disturbing the blood acid-base balance. So it's almost that we're provoking the body into a severe acidity in order to get the body to make adaptations. And those adaptations are probably happening inside in the muscle compartment, that the buffering capacity is increasing with phosphates, with proteins, to a lesser extent bicarbonate. And if you can improve the buffering capacity inside in the muscle, you're able to delay lactic acid, you're able to delay fatigue. And I think it's very important for, individuals such as baseball, anybody involved in sprinting, for example.
How do you track that over time? Like, how do I know that I'm making progress or I'm delaying I have a higher threshold until I reach a lactic acid state?
Well, people tend to know just from their experience.
Their feel, yeah.
Their feel. And the other thing is, we use what's called a maximum breathlessness test. So we have two measurements that we use. One is the Bolt score, which gives us some indication of functional breathing patterns during rest, and in turn will tell us the degree of breathlessness to some extent during physical exercise. And the other test that we use is the maximum breathlessness test. And this is the maximum number of paces that you can hold your breath for while walking. And the goal is for an athlete to be able to take a normal breath in and out through their nose, pinch their nose, and walk holding their breath for up to about 100 paces. And I know that this sounds a lot, but the athlete mightn't do it the first time. But if they practice it and practice the exercise over a period of time, they achieve this. And I think there's a number of things going on. You were talking about the feeling of breathlessness.
Yeah.
We're deliberately inducing a state of breathlessness far beyond what you would experience even during high intensity interval training. And we may be training the brain. It's almost like we're resetting the central governor we're telling the body that you can push yourself harder and faster without overdoing it. So that's one aspect of it. But there's other things in terms of doing breath holding. We also use them to open up the airways, to open up the nose, open up the bronchioles, the lungs, and also to increase blood flow to the brain. And it also adds an extra load onto the breathing muscles. And aside from that, I think nose breathing during part of the training, just as you described with the sleigh, I think it's really, really important. It's tough, and hardly anybody is doing it, Harvey.
Right.
But those who are doing it are going to get the gains. And I can talk about a paper on that in a few minutes if you like.
Oh,
because
for sure.
The science is only starting to catch up. But George Dallam, Dallam, he's an academic from one of the universities in the United States.
Okay.
And I think he's a fairly well-known triathlete. And he switched to nose breathing during his running about 3-4 years ago. And in 2018 or 2019, he published a paper. He got 6, or is it, I think 10 recreational athletes. Now, he spent 2 years trying to recruit athletes who would maintain nose breathing during all physical exercise for 6 months. And at the end of 2 years, he finally recruited 10. So it goes to show the
Wow.
unwillingness of people to devote all of their training, and these were recreational athletes,
Yeah.
to nasal breathing.
Now is that
So in any,
is that the whole exercise, like lifting,
yeah,
everything nasal?
everything was
Wow.
nasal. Yeah. So they trained because it makes more sense, you
Yeah, it
know.
does.
It doesn't make sense to kind of get a group of athletes and say, okay, lads, today you're going to breathe through your nose, and I want to test how do you do when you breathe through your nose. Their results are going to be crap. And the results will be crap because they've probably never done nasal breathing during exercise before.
Right.
The air hunger that they will feel will be too much. This will inhibit their progress. So instead, when we are working with athletes, I want to devote part of their training to nasal breathing because this is what's forcing the body to make adaptations. And this is what Dalam did for 6 months. So at the end of 6 months, he then got the guys, he retested them, and he tested the difference in terms of physical exercise and performance, nasal breathing versus mouth breathing. In nose breathing, they had 39 breaths per minute, and in mouth breathing, it was 49.
Wow.
In nose breathing, the CO2 in the blood was 44 millimeters of mercury pressure, and with mouth breathing, it was 40. Now, higher tolerance to carbon dioxide is actually very, very beneficial because if you can tolerate higher CO2 levels in the blood, you've got reduced breathlessness. And they had 22% less ventilation. So these athletes, they were recreational. After 6 months of training with the mouth closed, when they were then tested with mouth breathing versus nose breathing, they were able to perform a 100% work rate intensity on a graded exercise test, but with 22% less ventilation. Now, can you imagine somebody being able to do 100% of their work rate intensity, but with 22% less ventilation? It's a huge saving
It's
in terms of
insane.
economy. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's huge.
It's absolutely insane. You know, you got me thinking because I came across breathing like most people. I would say in 2015, I found Wim Hof online. I don't necessarily do like a Wim Hof practice. It just brought me closer to breath as an awareness, and then over the years, I just started diving into it. Breathing's a huge part of baseball and what I specifically do, and you know, when you talk about lowering your breath rate and practicing these sort of things, you know, I also think of it as it just like being able to solve problems like mentally, and you touch that with the getting more blood into the brain within the respiratory rate lowering. You know, I think of it as if you're playing a sport like golf, baseball, tennis, or anything that is can move fast in your mind, you know, unlike a football
Yeah.
sport or basketball. I mean, if you're just kind of running back and forth on defense, offense. If I'm playing baseball, I mean, it's mostly just thinking. And if we can breathe less, we're going to be better problem solvers. We're going to solve more things. We're going to make better choices. And that's kind of that mind body connection that I've found a lot through nasal breathing, because you breathe less. So you think slower, you think calmer. Is that something that you guys have studied as well?
I totally agree with you. There's very little science on it,
Yeah.
but we know a number of things. There is a calmness of the mind when your breathing is slow and diaphragmatic. And nose breathing imposes slow breathing and diaphragmatic breathing because your nose imposes a resistance to your breathing that's about 2 to 3 times that of the mouth. And resistance is positive in this manner. It simply slows down the breath. And when you breathe slower, the mind is calmer. But if you have somebody who's breathing fast and upper chest breathing, their mind is in a state of agitation. And when there's a lot of thought activity going through the mind, it's difficult to have clarity of thinking. Like, it's really ironic that the time that somebody needs to have focus of the mind, they're less likely to do so. It's when they are stressed.
Yeah.
Because when you're stressed, you really need focus of the mind. But also when you're stressed, it's the most difficult time to have focus of the mind. So I think it's very important to impart a breathing technique to train the brain to be concentrated, both from a psychological point of view, but also in terms of increasing blood flow to the brain and increasing oxygen delivery to the brain. Because we need to make this point, Harvey, that the harder you breathe, it doesn't necessarily mean that more blood flow and oxygen is going to be delivered to the brain.
Right.
During rest, if you start breathing hard, or if you're breathing harder during physical exercise, breathing more air than what you need, this is going to have the opposite effect. It's going to reduce oxygen uptake in the blood. It's going to reduce blood flow to the brain. It's going to reduce blood flow throughout the body, and it's going to reduce oxygen delivery to tissues and organs, including the brain. So when breathing is optimal, the emotions tend to be calmer, and also sleep.
Yeah.
And it's a huge part of it. Sleep and recovery is massive. Like last night, I didn't have a particularly good night's sleep, and this morning I felt it. And normally my sleep is pretty good.
Yeah.
So don't ask me why was it not last night, but just the way it is. But I think if your breathing is really a huge role to play in terms of optimal sleep.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have really good sleep quality, the mind is very focused.
Absolutely.
And it all goes together. Breathing, sleep, and emotions are all interconnected. And if one is off, the other two are off.
It's wild you say that. One of the things that I read in Oxygen Advantage, and this is where, again, I was so excited to talk to you. I didn't sleep well last night, more so because I just didn't want to. I knew I was getting up early to talk, and I just kept predicting, this conversation.
Oversleeping or something. Yeah.
Yeah. But one of the reasons why I was so excited to talk to you was because I had 3 years ago. 3 or 3.5 years ago, I had a throat cyst, and I was a mouth breather. And you talk a lot about like the jaw structure and crooked teeth and all these sort of things. And that's exactly what I had and have, obviously. And I was a mouth breather all the way up. That's another day for another conversation, but I'm convinced that at the end of my professional baseball career, I tapped out mentally, emotionally, physically, and I'm convinced it was because I was a mouth breather and never knew, and I just tapped. My energy was it was done, and again, that's another day. But I had a throat surgery, and I would always, after the surgeries, I couldn't sleep because I would wake up with my mouth dry all the time. Mm-hmm. It was like every 45, 60 minutes I'd have to drink water. And I did this for a few months, and then I'd get sick again and sick again and sick again. And then I came across Oxygen Advantage, and I started taping my mouth shut. And I've taped my mouth shut for the last 2 years, or I might even be longer. And I've had nothing. Haven't had nothing wrong with my throat. I have saliva when I wake up. I sleep sound and peaceful and hard, and that's a lot of what you're saying too. But that cleared up. Like even you mentioned like your sinuses and your congestion. I don't really have much problems breathing clear through my nose. Is that a lot to do with just simply closing that mouth during sleep?
Yeah, totally. The nose works better when we use it.
Mm-hmm.
And the ironic thing is that when the nose gets stuffy, it creates an air hunger when people try to breathe through the nose. So they switch to mouth breathing. But when they switch to mouth breathing, their nose gets worse. It becomes even more stuffier. So if you want your nose to function better, we have to use it. And albeit it's a bit tough at the start. And I've got very compromised nose because I've came across this area just by accident, and I've the same issues as you. Poor sleep quality. I was stopping breathing during sleep. I was a very heavy snorer. And when I first switched, I used a nose unblocking technique, simply holding the breath.
Mm-hmm.
And that opened up my nose about 20 years ago. And then I started switching to nose breathing, and I was feeling suffocated when I started switching from mouth to nose breathing, but I kept with it, and it made a huge difference to my sleep as well. And how can people focus, regardless of what age they are? And this, Harvey, goes right back down to kids.
Yeah.
And here is the big issue here. Nobody is talking about it. Nobody is talking about children who are mouth breathing, the effect it's having on their sleep, the effect it's having on their ADD, their behavior, their academic performance, the development of their face, the development of their brain. And it's really a big problem. And we know that 25 to 50% of kids persistently mouth breathe. And, there are some healthcare professionals who are really getting behind it, but it hasn't become mainstream. And this isn't alternative. Like people say breathing is alternative. Breathing is absolutely physiological. It's the normal functions of the human body. And the nose performs the functions of filtration, moistening, conditioning, regulating volume, harnessing nasal nitric oxide, protects the lungs, and yet nobody seems to talk about it. And I'll just go one stage further because it's very timely. COVID-19, coronavirus.
Yeah.
Like, nobody knows the mechanism behind that. And we don't know if nose breathing is going to, what effect will it have. But all I will say with this, I think people are in a much better position in terms of defending themselves against this virus than a mouth breather, because your nose, there's a gas called nitric oxide that's produced in the paranasal sinuses and probably inside in the nasal cavity. And nitric oxide is an antiviral. And it's been known to kill a lot of different viruses. Now, whether it kills COVID-19,
Right.
we don't know because that needs to be tested. But, let's start with nasal breathing. And I put a post up on Instagram and we had people coming back, it's not scientific. Come on, give me a break on this, will you? Like, the mouth is definitely not. The mouth performs absolutely no functions. And the other thing is, if you breathe through your nose, you're taking in less air. So you're less likely to be taking in as many droplets. People have to get real about this. And sometimes people are saying, show me the science. We don't always have the science, but we know it works. And I've been working with this for 20 years with people with a lot of chronic conditions. And you talked about waking up with a dry mouth in the morning. It wasn't just that your mouth was dry, your throat is dry and your airways are dry. Mm-hmm. And if moisture is sucked out of the lungs, it causes bronchoconstriction. And if the airways are narrowing, well, then it's going to increase the risk of exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, and this will hamper performance. So breathing is just one of those things that are so simple, and the medical profession have been so slow to embrace it, probably because it's so simple.
Well, that's what I've been wanting to ask you this a lot too, is, obviously I'm a believer too. So, I'm sitting here on the side going, who cares? We don't need the science, and I read that post and I loved it. I showed that post to a bunch of people about nasal breathing. And so I'm just curious, as someone who looks like, I look up to you in that regard, because you've had to handle so many punches, and you're, in my opinion, you're the pioneer that's going to help push this across the world. And that's amazing. So it's like, how have you personally taken the hits from like the medical side or the science side and just known how to continue to push off of your intuition of that people need to do this?
Well, I think the biggest thing was it worked for me.
Yeah.
And it's worked for a lot of people that I've worked with over the years. I've worked with thousands of people, kids as well. And there's no side effects from this. So I never feel guilty. If somebody comes into me and they tell me, they have tinnitus or they have migraine or they have this stress and that stress, I'm saying, okay, well, I mightn't be altogether sure that I can help you, but let's give it a go, because you're not going to lose anything by simply breathing through your nose, by focusing on your breathing, by slowing down the breath. Your body oxygenation improves, your sleep improves, your mind is calmer. And a lot of conditions are influenced by stress. So I always have that kind of grounding. It was actually very good that it really helped me in my own health.
Yeah.
And, people could say, well, it doesn't work. Well, I know it works. I know personally, without a doubt, it works. And I know it works in longevity because I'm 20 years doing it and it's worked for me over that time. So the other thing is, I don't tend to waste my energy on trying to convince people. Mm-hmm. I wasted my energy back in 2002 and 2003 and 2004. Just to give you an example, the Irish Asthma Society.
Yeah.
And, we've got 500,000 people with asthma in a very small country. And It's about 10% of our population. And it's about 8% of the population in the United States. And nobody tells these people with asthma, breathe through your nose. You can imagine having a lung condition that really needs that air to be filtered and moistened and regulated, and to harness nasal nitric oxide, to increase oxygen uptake in the blood, to sterilize the incoming air. Like nitric oxide, one of the roles of that in the nasal cavity, as air is drawn into the nose and brought into the lungs, it cleans the incoming air of bacteria and viruses, as we spoke about. People with asthma have coughing, wheezing, breathlessness. They don't just have asthma, they have poor sleep. Nobody seems to talk about breathe through your nose. And I contacted the local asthma society in Ireland, and they showed no interest.
Wow.
And, it wasn't even that. I'll give you a story. I
Yeah.
went to a medical conference, and it was about asthma, and it was organized by the Asthma Society of Ireland. This was in 2005. And I sat down there. I was on my own at the conference. And the CEO of the Asthma Society of Ireland sat down beside me at the time. And she started talking to me. And I was wondering, why is she sitting down here beside me?
Yeah.
And she said, Patrick, she says, I would rather if you didn't ask any questions to our panel.
Come on.
And that's why she sat down beside me to silence me. So on that basis, Harvey, I said, okay, I'm not going to waste any energy on the people I can't convince, but I'm going to put out the information. So that's why I started really writing books. And we've just for kids, I've got very frustrated because children, there's millions of children out there. And by the way, I can show you medical articles going back to 1909. Okay, people will say, well, the science wasn't great back in 1909. It wasn't. But they were good observations by intelligent people.
Yeah.
And Dental Cosmos is an American dental journal at the time. And it talked about mouth-breathing children. These kids are unattentive in school. Their face is dull and expressionless. The children will accuse them of daydreaming. These kids aren't performing. This was discussed back in 1909.
Over 100 years ago.
It's the same issues are facing kids today. So this week we put out all of the children's videos completely free on YouTube. So,
wow.
So yeah, people might say, well, you're going to lose business. Yeah, that's fine. But we're getting it out there. And that's my approach. And that's why with the Oxygen Advantage, I put out all of the exercises. And I have a new book. I'm writing 2 new books at the moment. And we're going to put out everything into it, because this is the way you really get your information out there. Because people can buy a book for $15 or $20. Mm-hmm. They haven't really wasted. It's not a big risk. And if they see something in it, if they feel a difference, they know then that there's something in it. And that's how we're getting the information out there. So, so that's how I do it. I don't care about the comments. Yeah, I replied to a couple of the comments on Instagram this morning. And I said, listen, I posted this just to bring attention to the importance of nose breathing.
Yeah.
And that's it. And I said, look at the work of Professor John Lundberg. Nitric oxide was only discovered on the exhale breath of the human in 1991. So it's a fairly recent discovery, even though there's a lot of papers on it. So the exact science of nitric oxide isn't altogether clear, even for sleep, but it's known that nitric oxide is a very potent defense in terms of the air coming into the lungs. Let's start with it.
That is inspiring, man. I mean, you're right too. If you read the Oxygen Advantage, you learn so much. And that's it's amazing, especially now, because the information, there's so much out there from so many different angles, but then the way that you kind of simplify, but then show why and how. I mean, you can learn about your whole life in the Oxygen Advantage of breathing for anybody, and it does cover many rounds. And so I wanted to hammer home on the asthma that you were just talking about. And what are some ways people who are going to listen to this who might have asthma or know someone who has asthma that maybe doesn't read the book? What are some ways what's a simple way to start to improve your asthma other than just focusing and being aware of nasal breathing? Is there any sort of hypoxic training or anything that you do with anyone with asthma to help them improve their breathing?
Yeah, they could even go to the children's course, even if they're adults, and start doing the kids' course. Just don't do any strong breath holds if you're pregnant or if you have any high blood pressure, any cardiovascular illness or serious medical conditions. Don't do strong breath holds. Mm-hmm. But, if you're pregnant, don't do any breathing exercises. But I would say with people with asthma, just how do you breathe? Yeah. Do you breathe through an open mouth? Just start switching to nose breathing. If your nose is stuffy, I've got a nose unblocking exercise up on YouTube. Just put in, I don't know what you put in, but Patrick McKeown unblock the nose.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll pull it up. And do that 5 or 6 times. Don't do it again if you're pregnant or serious medical issues. That will open up your nose temporarily. Then measure your Bolt score. And if your Bolt score is less than 25 seconds, you will continue to have coughing, wheezing, and breathlessness until you get your Bolt score up to 20 seconds, say. So how do you get your Bolt score up to 20 seconds? Do the nose unblocking technique. If you're wheezing or coughing, go to YouTube and look up the video, How to Stop Coughing and Wheezing by Patrick McKeown. You see that video there? And then, so that will help you with your symptoms. And then to learn slow breathing, you could either go to the children's video on Buteyko Clinic on the YouTube channel, or you can look at my TEDx talk, and I guided the audience through the exercise slow breathing to generate air hunger. And then when you do your physical exercise, make sure you go easy for the first 10 minutes, because it's really important for people with asthma to warm up. And warming up by nasal breathing, by going very easy, because this is preparing the lungs, preparing the airways to be able to handle the volume of air better. And sustain nasal breathing throughout your physical exercise. I put an article up on the benefits of nasal breathing during exercise, which I can send to you later on.
For sure.
And awesome. Taping of the mouth seems a bit bizarre. We brought out a new tape that doesn't cover the lips, but it surrounds the lips, and it brings the mouth together by elasticity. So it's based on kinesio tape. So kinesio tape is elastic. So we've cut the tapes. We've had the tapes pre-cut and into sizes that you stretch the tape about 20%, and you place it surrounding the mouth, and it's the elasticity of the tape that brings the lips together. So now you can have nose breathing during sleep without risk, even with kids.
Yeah.
And that was our issue. Our issue was, how do we get kids breathing through the nose during sleep? And that's why I had to think of something, and that's how the tape came out. Now, adults traditionally have been using different tapes, 3M, 1-inch micropore tape.
Too. Yeah.
And there's there's lip seal tape from a doctor in Colorado called Dr. Frank Seaman. And we have Myo tape coming out, and you'll see different tapes on Amazon or whatever. But yeah, I would say to anybody, never wake up with a dry mouth in the morning, regardless if you're a severe asthmatic or if you're an elite athlete. You should never wake up with a dry mouth, because it's trauma to your airways, it's trauma to the lungs, and you want to give your airways a rest. You're using them during the day. You might be mouth breathing during physical exercise, but then if you're adding extra trauma to your airways during your sleep, that's not good. And also the risk is, if you're a big guy, say the weightlifters or NFL guys, the defense guys, they have a large neck circumference. And generally with a male, if the neck is about 17 inches, there's a risk of having obstructive sleep apnea. And obstructive sleep apnea is when you stop breathing during your sleep. Breathing. So the tongue might fall into the airway, or the soft palate, or the throat itself collapses. And then you drives up blood pressure, it puts a stress on the heart. So if you have an athlete then who is stopping breathing during the day, they're also putting their heart under stress during the day, which is fine. But the only problem is the heart isn't getting any recovery. So I would say to guys, make sure you breathe through your nose, make sure you get the tongue resting in the roof of the mouth, but also breathe using your diaphragm. And when I talk about diaphragm breathing, I'm talking about abdominal breathing with lateral expansion and contraction of the lower two ribs. Because if you breathe using your diaphragm, it increases lung volume, and this in turn causes a stiffening of the throat, so it's less likely to collapse during sleep.
You cut out a little bit on that one where you're talking about big neck sleepers, so I can't really. I just go back on that just real quick. Everything else was nails, but in terms of, were you saying because I was going to ask a question too of, if you sleep on your back, does your tongue fall into the throat?
Yes. Will I start again there?
Yeah, just start again on the big neck sleeping for football guys, or big guys, I suppose.
Yeah. So even there's a condition which is very common now in the Western world and is receiving a lot more attention. It's called obstructive sleep apnea. And obstructive sleep apnea is when there is either a partial collapse of the airways during sleep. And when I'm talking about the airways, I'm talking about the upper airway. That's the throat. And or there could be a complete collapse of the upper airway. If it's a partial collapse, it's called a hypopnea. And if it's a complete collapse, it's called an apnea. Now, if you have an athlete and they're big guys, they're weightlifters or they're playing NFL or whatever, and if their neck circumference is greater than 17 inches, they are at a higher risk of having obstructive sleep apnea. So if they go to sleep and they have collapse of their airways, collapse of the throat during sleep, this is going to drive up their blood pressure, but it puts a stress on their heart. So if they have a risk of sleep apnea, now how would they know if they have it? The only way to find out is to do a sleep study. But maybe their partner, or maybe, if they had a sleeping partner saying, well, I heard you sleeping last night and you were snoring and then you completely stopped breathing. Well, that's a sign that something is not right. I had this when I was in high school, and it was in university as well. The guys were telling me in the dorms, student dorms, they were saying, Jesus, we thought you were going to die last night.
Wow.
And that's what they thought, because they'd hear really hard snoring and then complete stopping, complete silence. And it's because your throat has collapsed. Your body is trying to take in air, but the throat has collapsed. And it's almost that you're fighting for breath. But what this does is it partially wakens you up from sleep, even though you're not conscious of being woken up.
Yeah.
So you have continuous sleep fragmentation, and then you're waking up feeling lousy. Now some people feel all right when they wake up, but about 50% of them will feel fairly tired, or they will collapse in the afternoon. They don't have the energy levels throughout the day. But so what I would say to the big guys, or any gal who is at risk of obstructive sleep apnea, make sure you get your mouth closed. Also, make sure that your tongue is resting in the roof of the mouth. And you should have about 3/4 of your tongue resting up in the roof of the mouth, because your tongue has got two places to be. It's either in the roof of the mouth or it's falling into the throat. And you don't want your tongue falling into the throat. Your throat is only about the width. The diameter of the throat is about the width of a garden hose pipe. It's about 1/2 an inch or so. And that's a decent enough airway. So you can imagine we don't have much room for error there. And if we're having poor sleep quality, and if we're having increased stress in the heart during sleep, well, during physical exercise, the athlete is also putting their heart under stress. And this could be an added stress. And then we are wondering why an athlete of 40 years of age died in their sleep. Well, unfortunately, when I hear it, I have to suspect it could have been obstructive sleep apnea, and it could have been prevented.
Well, and that's also, you're in a state of fight or flight for an entire evening of sleep.
Correct.
When you're doing that. And that's going to have the psychological issues, and that could go down the laundry list of recovery. That's where you're talking about, that's where you see these professional athletes reach for, or just people in general have to reach for stimulants all day to try to sustain their energy. Where your breathing that's the homeostasis and lifeline of what we are. I've been wanting to ask you this, and I don't know if there's necessarily an answer to this or not, but what made us mouth breathers? Do you guys have anything on that, or anything that you've seen from history that shows how we evolved this way?
I think it's a combination of different things. If you look, researchers they published a paper about 2 years ago on Neanderthals, which are related to us in some way, but they talked about the Neanderthals having these really wide nostrils. And the wide nostrils was not just about breathing through the nose during rest, but also breathing through the nose during physical exercise. And also, if you go to a natural history museum, and if you look at skulls, you'll tend to see that they've really well-developed arches, that their jaws are perfectly shaped, wide, U-shaped, plenty of room for the tongue in the mouth, and they've also got forward direction of growth of the face. But if you look at the modern face, it tends to be longer, it's narrower, and the jaws are set back and the airway is compromised. Now, Professor John Mew, or Dr. John Mew, he's an orthodontist from the UK, and his son also works as an orthodontist, Dr. Mike Mew. And John Mew, he spoke about when they unearthed the graves of upper middle class background, people who had access to sugar. This was about 400 years ago. That was when they noted the first documented cases of crooked teeth.
Wow.
So crooked teeth, you can imagine throughout our evolution, we've had relatively straight teeth. We have had well-developed faces, well-developed jaws. And the last 100 years, maybe, and I would even say the last 40, 50 years, we've really seen a change in the shape of the jaws. And the bad thing about this is it's not just that it's the shape of the jaws, it's the size of the airway.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's an orthodontist in California called Dr. William Hang, and he's one of these orthodontists that when he's straightening children's teeth, he's really more concerned about the size of their airway, because he knows as an orthodontist, he doesn't want to pull teeth. He doesn't want to be retracting the jaws and the face, because some orthodontists, unfortunately, even to this day, if the child presents with overcrowding of teeth, they will say that the teeth are too big for the jaw, so we need to remove these teeth. Where William Hang is saying the problem is not with the size of the teeth. The problem is the size of the jaw.
Yeah.
The jaw is too small for the child. And the reason that the jaw is too small is because the tongue wasn't resting in the roof of the mouth, because it's the pressures exerted by the tongue which helps to develop the jaw and also to direct the growth of the face forward in the face. So you've got really tremendous orthodontists who are aware of this,
Right.
and some who are not aware of it. And other things to look out for would be, mouth breathing, I think, is one factor. Processed foods, it seems to have some impact on breathing. Tongue tie, pacifier use. I read one paper, every year that a child uses a pacifier, it increases the risk of mouth breathing by 25%. So there's probably a number, lack of breastfeeding because of society. You know, mothers have to go back to work, both members of the couple, you know, really high mortgages, and both parents have to work to pay off the mortgage, so the child isn't able to breastfeed. And breastfeeding is not just about nutrition, but it's also about manipulation of the muscles of the face necessary for craniofacial growth.
Absolutely.
So if you think, you know, a child that's taken milk from a breast, the child has to really work their muscles of the face, and this develops good muscle tone. And here's the thing, Harvey, good-looking people tend to have well-developed facial structures and good airways. And, you know, sometimes if I'm traveling, I have to go into, you know, if you stop off and there's nothing else open at 12 o'clock at night, and you go into a fast food place, which I don't tend to do very often. But look at the caliber of the people inside it. And I don't know, I don't want to make this judgment, but they're generally not the most attractive people. Right. So I often see that, you know, people who are tending to go, and I know that's a very general statement, and, you know, I don't mean it to be general, but keep an eye out, and, you know, it's only an observation. Look at the people who are really indulging in fast food and processed foods.
Yeah.
You know, why is it they don't have beautiful, well-functioned and developed faces?
Yeah.
Now, what's caused what? I don't know.
Well, it's wild you say that too, because I think of I think of like Major League All-Stars or NFL All-Stars or Pro Bowlers or whatnot. Their jaw structures are strong, like they have those strong jawbones. I mean, I've looked at that a lot since I started seeing and studying a little bit of the jaw structure, because I saw Laird Hamilton. I think I heard him say one time about our jaws were narrowing. It was just in passing, but it stayed with me for some reason, which is why I wanted to ask you that. And I've started noticing that of just the elite athletes out there too. You see just like strong faces, strong jaws.
Yeah. It's because you don't become an elite athlete if you have a compromised airway.
Right.
I was at Dr. William Hang there, I don't know, about 3 years ago, and he took a scan of my airways. And he said, your airways are goosed, you know, like my airway is totally compromised from years of mouth breathing. I'd never be an athlete, never. So there's a reason. It's not just a coincidence that really good looking guys and gals with well-developed jaws, that they are at the top of the echelons, because you need a good airway. You need efficient breathing, but you also need good function. You need a good airway to compete and to get to that level. And that's why they're up there. So you think of the face of the young kid who's mouth breathing, and, you know, this again has been debated. And all you have to do is just go into Google and put in adenoid face. An adenoid face, you'll see all of these images of kids with long faces. They're tired looking. They're really not the most attractive kids. You know, their mouth is open, and it's terrible. And the other thing is, if you have a child, if any of your listeners are having kids and their kids are mouth breathing, and you bring your child to have an adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy, that's all very well. But unless nasal breathing is restored, there's a 65% worsening of the AHI index, which is the apnea-hypopnea index, within 3 years. So adenoidectomy and tonsillectomy is only short-term unless nose breathing is restored. And the other thing about enlarged adenoids causing mouth breathing, it's not necessarily the enlarged adenoids that's the problem. It's the airway that's the problem. Because if the airway is small and the adenoids are enlarged, the child can't breathe through the nose. But if you have enlarged adenoids and if you have a large airway, the child will generally be able to breathe through the nose. The issue is the airway, not the adenoids.
That's a fascinating. Well, last little question here. Is there a way, I mean, because I feel like my life has tremendously changed after focusing on nasal breathing. Like I said, I train all our athletes to nasal breathe. And obviously you've made a huge conscious effort for years doing that. Do people see enhanced scores cognitively, physically, even if they started out early childhood as mouth breathers in their adulthood or whatnot, or whenever they switch over or transition? Do people reverse or improve the way do you have anything that shows enhanced mental, physical, emotional? Like, do you reverse the cycle, or is it sort of with you forever?
I think it's always possible to improve.
Yeah.
Neuroplasticity, the brain is constantly changing, and we know, I know more of the studies that mouth breathing kids, they can have 10 times the risk of learning difficulties. If a child is mouth breathing, and if the mouth breathing is causing sleep disorder breathing, which is snoring pretty much, that child, if it's untreated by the age of 8, they have an 80% chance of a permanent 20% reduction in their mental capacity. Now, I can send on that paper to you after this.
Yeah.
But can you reverse that? That I don't know. But all I'm going to say is this. We have seen countless cases of people, their concentration has improved, their focus, their ability to hold information. And it would be just people saying it to us. And that's going to be a combination of improved sleep, calmer mind, and even just like meditation, for example,
Yeah.
which is focusing on the breath. Meditators will tend to be able to perform better in stressful situations. And this has been proven in different tests, including Stroop tests, etc. And when you're focusing on your breathing, you're never wasting time because you're training the brain to be concentrated. And concentration is your ability to hold your attention on a subject matter for a period of time without distraction. Now, for 20 years, I had a really distracted mind, and I would overthink everything. And I would overthink it to the point of not reaching a decision because I was analyzing it and I was stuck in my head all the time. And it was only when I started really connecting with my breath that I started to see more around me, missing less. Like, how can you retain information or come up with good ideas if your mind is in a constant state of distraction with repetitive and incessant thinking? And, we can solve that and help reduce it from a number of perspectives. Improve sleep, increased oxygen delivery to the brain, improve blood flow, of course, to the brain, but also focusing on the breath to train the brain to be concentrated. And everybody can deal with that. Everybody can do it. Like nobody can have 100% of their attention on the job at hand, regardless of what it is,
Right.
if they are stuck in their heads. And 20 years ago, I learned to get out of my head. And I was really an overthinker, perfectionist tendencies, highly stressed. And you know what? You achieve nothing when you're stuck in your head because you don't have the concentration to apply it to the task at hand. So I think for everybody, I think it's worthwhile starting it.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. How can, as we wrap up here, how can people find you? Obviously, you mentioned the YouTube, and we'll do our best to promote it as well. But just what are the simplest ways for people to continuously keep up with your work and listen to you and find you and those sort of things?
Yeah, I suppose social media, I've kind of just got onto it last 1 year. So I've been a latecomer, but we've got Instagram is Oxygen Advantage. Then Oxygen Advantage is more so for sports performance. And Buteyko Clinic is for health. So the same name as the websites, oxygenadvantage.com, buteykoclinic.com, and YouTube channels the same. And the YouTube channels is where we put up a lot of free videos as well. So we're just, a lot of the exercises from the book, etc., you'll find up there.
Well, keep pushing, Patrick. It was an absolute honor to have you on, man. And I like to thank everybody for their time, as that's so valuable now. And so to have some of your time and to share that, it means the world to the team, the whole MindStrong team, and then myself personally, to be able to sit on the other side of this mic and ask you questions is something I've been visualized for a long time. I don't have a problem saying it. So it's an honor to have talked to you, man. And your work is unbelievably life-changing, and I hope this helps many people, and you guys keep pushing, and I'll be following and supporting from afar. But thank you again for the time, and best of luck as you keep pushing forward the human experience.
It's a pleasure, Harvey. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Have a good day. I'll talk to you soon.
You too.
Cheers.